Hello, everybody. We are here today with Dr. Lloyd Sederer, psychiatrist, public health doctor, and journalist. And boy, are you in for a treat. He's an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Public Health and directs Columbia Psychiatry Media. Dr. Sederer comes from humble beginnings, being raised in the Bronx, and now is arguably one of the most influential psychiatrists in the nation. He's authored a dozen books, has a TED Talk, and regularly appears on the radio, TV, and in the news. In fact, he was medical editor for the HuffPost for mental health for years and contributing writer for the US News and World Report and The Atlantic. More likely than not, you've read and shared his articles online. And he's a dear friend of mine and also really one of the originator ideas of why Ask the Expert is even a series. Dr. Sederer, your decades of wisdom and clinical experience are needed now more than ever. With our impending opiate crisis and record increases of opiate-related deaths since the pandemic began, I really look forward to having a conversation with you and hearing answers to some of the most commonly questions that you hear from your patients around addiction. So thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, and I'm very proud that Columbia is working with Psych Hub. I think we're really a strong team to convey a trustworthy and important information to people who are seeking it.
Let's start with opiates and other drugs. The epidemic has seized our country, not only today, but for the past 2 centuries. These epidemics, such as heroin, Oxycontin, and other opiate pills like fentanyl, crack, crystal meth, etc., have produced great human, social, and financial harm. Yet they persist. I just was hoping that you could help us understand addiction and what happens with these psychoactive drugs. What does it do? What are the effects that it has on the brain?
This is the central question. Why such a big problem persists and, in fact, has been getting worse. And I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago called The Addiction Solution. And the premise of that book is asking and answering the question, why do people do this? Why does society persist in allowing this to happen? And my answer is that people use drugs because they serve them. They have physical pain, they have emotional pain, they simply want to transport themselves away from the everyday grind. And these drugs are very effective and very powerful, and they serve those needs for people. That's not to say that down the line they won't backfire, but they are the fastest and most effective solutions to our pain and our troubles. And that's why people use them. And that's why there isn't one society on the globe that doesn't use commonly intoxicating substances.
That's so interesting. So really, it's the escape. That's that first piece, it sounds like, to transport. I like that word transport, kind of take you out of yourself and then bring you into a new place. So, you're right. Every part of the world sees this. Are there certain types, personal or social factors that put people at risk for drug dependence? And then at the same time, are there like factors that help protect you against drug dependence?
Yes, in public health, we study what are called protective factors and risk factors, and they apply whether it's to addiction or to mental conditions, even physical conditions. And it helps a lot, protects you. If you have supportive family and friends, people you care about and who care about you, it helps literally to have an education. It helps even more to have a job. And it helps, interestingly, and because I led the mental health responses to 9/11, Hurricane Sandy. One of the big things we learned there is that what is amazingly protective is faith. And
Wow.
faith is not, sometimes it's in the form of organized religion, but for many people, it's more a spiritual center that they have. It's a belief that there is a higher power, that there is some way that we are a part of a greater universe. And that spiritual center or religious center predicts people's capacity to tolerate all kinds of troubles, disaster, and to bounce back, to recover, to be resilient. And then there are those experiences that many people have, sadly, that put them at much higher risk. For example, very commonly childhood trauma, which has been studied and which begins early in life but persists. It changes the psychology and the neurochemistry of the brain. Trauma is highly prevalent and it puts us at risk. Also, for people who already have a condition, whether they're dependent on alcohol or opioids, they're at and they've gained some ground on that when something unfortunate happens, or when we live in the deep uncertainty that we do today with COVID, they relapse. That is a vulnerability. So there are these are important because we know who's at risk, and those are the people we need to reach out to right away and help them not get sick. And then we need to foster emotional supports, family supports, faith, all those things that give people a better chance to tolerate all kinds of problems.
A friend of mine had a meth addiction to meth, and he had a very stable job and a very stable career. And what happened with him was a series of events that happened at the same time. He lost a parent, he lost a job, and was having some other kind of personal some stress in his relationship. And it was the combination of those things at a rare moment when someone said, and no drug experience at all, try this. Yeah. And he got hooked. So, it's interesting to think too of that, sometimes it's piling it on. And when you think about, like you said, the prospects, right? So if it's just maybe too much for one person to handle, and then you bring in what you mentioned earlier about the escape, and can be maybe when they all come together.
Yeah, I thank you for returning to that point, because that's where we have to meet people, that we need to understand and not be judgmental, that all this misfortune may be happening, and then they're given a substance as a teenager, sometimes as an adult, and it remedies how they feel. It takes them from the pain to a sense of comfort or pleasure. That's where we have to begin, because that's why people are using and continue to use. And that's where we have to meet them, and we have to give them ways by which to solve those very problems with other means than psychoactive drugs.
So my next question for you is, can you help us understand what actually happens in the brain? I mean, we know that there are these substances, and how fast do they get in there? How does it work? How does it work out that you smoke something or you eat something, and then what's actually happening?
That's a really critical question, and I will give us a little tour of the brain in order to understand, because each of these 4 places in the brain not only are part of the understanding, but they're where we need to intervene. They're the spots that we want to alter in a way, because addiction's a tough disease, stubborn disease. If you hit all 4 of these areas, a person's going to stand a better chance. So person takes a drug, they inhale it, they inject it, and goes through the bloodstream to the brain. And the first place it lands is the site, the pleasure center, the site, nucleus accumbens, the site where dopamine is released. Dopamine, feel-good drug. And it's released in the brain, and it sets off a cascade of other parts of the brain. So it goes from the pleasure center to the motivational center, ventral tegmental cortex. What is that? That's our experience. Hey, I like that. I want more of that. That's another center that we can influence, motivational. Interviewing, for example, and in the first, though, with the dopamine, we now have 3 FDA drugs that help people control their cravings. So the pleasure center, the motivational center, and then there's a key part of the brain that is the memory center, the emotional memory center, the hippocampus and amygdala. And that's really important because we now have come to understand that people return to drugs, people relapse to drugs, not because of the drugs, but because of the cues in their environment. They see a drug deal going down. A friend calls who's high. Prince dies. These are all cues. And we learned along, these are what called conditioned responses. Remember Pavlov's dogs? He trained the dogs to salivate to a bell, not to the food. And that's what happens in this memory center. The cues get triggered by these events in our life. And that's a place also where we can make a difference, where we can build cognitive capacities. We can enable people to identify their cues, to have certain ways of behaving or thinking or rethinking in order to contain the cues. So you have these 3 centers, and then there's the part of our brain that we think a lot about, but isn't really very potent. And that's the cerebral cortex. That's the front of the brain. That also gets mobilized. And in the same way that the pleasure center is like the accelerator, the frontal cortex are the brakes, and they're not the greatest of brakes for a 16-wheeler going downhill at 50 miles an hour. But we need to work there as well, because our frontal cortex is where reasoning and judgment, responsibility derives from. And we know that that's enhanced by other people, by supports. That's even how I think AA and NA work. They create supports, family. So you put these 4 centers together, and that's the cascade in the brain. The explosion of dopamine, the motivation to get more, the cues, and this limited brake system. But each of these, if we approach them with treatments, with medication treatment for craving, with CBT for cues, and other cognitive interventions as well, relapse prevention, for example. And we learn to understand people's motivation. People use these drugs for a reason, and there are techniques that help us reach people, have them tilt their motivation. And then we want to give them a lot of supports so the front of their brain is got more musculature. So we have effective treatments. And if we understand the brain and we understand that each complements the other, we stand a pretty good chance of helping somebody.
And it's so interesting to just think about all the different things that are going on. And I'm going to guess when somebody is they're not even realizing how many different pieces of their brain are being activated. And I find it so interesting too, when you talk about somebody's own cognitions, their own thinking about what their triggers are, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so you really almost sounds like you have to have somebody who has insight or has done some work into knowing what their triggers, because my guess is that they're different for everybody. And then knowing what things to put in place when you feel, vulnerable from those triggers.
Yes. I see this as not insight, but rather skill building. that we're giving people skills to cope with what is a runaway situation emotionally and in their brain. And skill building, people can learn, people can affect the outcome of what might be a bad situation in a different way.
I like that, skill building, because that also can mean that anybody can learn those skills.
That's right.
And that's great because we know that relapse is such a real part of recovery. So I wonder if, you're able to continue learning skills if you relapse each time, knowing kind of what those different triggers were. So
Yes.
it's so fascinating. So not to sound pessimistic, but do people ever recover from addiction? And if they do, what is it? What works? We hear so much about what doesn't work. What
Yeah.
works?
People do recover. There have been many studies, what are called longitudinal studies, where people with tobacco addiction, alcohol, drugs are followed for 10 years or 15 or 20 years. And the amazing thing is that a substantial proportion of those people leave the substances behind. They recover. And there's no one path by which they do that. Some of them do that with treatment. Some of them do that with 12-step recovery programs. Some of them just do it themselves with the support of caring others. So we can't be definitive. We can't say you have to do this, you have to do that, but we have to breed a sense of hope that people do recover. We don't know when that's going to happen, whether it's after the third rehab or the 12th, but people recover. And that's the most important thing that families, I think, and people who are suffering from addiction need to understand, that there is recovery in the future for them if they don't kill themselves in the meantime.
Wow, that's so empowering too, to know that it's coming, and that you can recover from it, and that it's not the same path for everybody. And when you just think about people's own journey with it. And what about different substances? Do you find that if somebody has an issue with heroin, that they might recover from that but then move into alcoholism, or is it pretty much the same?
I think that when somebody gets on a recovery path, they understand that all of these substances are threats to their stability. And I think, interestingly, it's been studied. It's harder to quit smoking than it is to quit heroin.
Wow.
And rates of quitting smoking are not so good, and our treatments there are still pretty limited, but they're possible. So, and smoking is the deadliest of tobacco is the deadliest of drugs.
Wow. So really, they all could be a little bit different too. But ultimately, when you're in recovery, those skills that you learn can affect for all types of addiction, it sounds like. So my next question for you is, I just don't know why hasn't our country not done what works? And especially in the light of how persistent drug dependency is, how many lives it takes,
Yeah.
how it disrupts families. Why haven't we as a country done more?
That's the vital question. I try to focus in on that question in my addiction book. Winston Churchill said, "You can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." And that's what we keep doing. We keep trying everything else. And the two principal failed strategies that go back a really long time are control strategies and consequence strategies. So control is, prohibition, right? A totally failed effort to control what people want. Alcohol control strategies don't work, and we continue to spend vast amount of money on border interdiction, burning forests of drugs. This has had absolutely no effect. Control, and part of the control is also a belief that this type of being tough and these kind of photo ops that derive from, 1,000 pounds of heroin behind federal agents that they've seized, these look good, but they don't do anything. And consequences is the other strategy that we seem to like. Most commonly, it's exhortation. Don't you know that stuff's going to kill you? Don't you know it's ruining your family and your work? Of course they know. Exhortation is basically driving people away because they already know that and they recognize that you're judging them and they're already ashamed. And the other consequences, big in this country, are criminalization. That we have made substances a crime. And of the people in jails and prisons, vast numbers of them are there because they had an ounce and a half of marijuana or they were dealing small amounts. When you're hooked, you have three ways of keeping your habit going. You can steal, you can deal, or you can prostitute yourself. And these are the people that wind up in criminal justice settings. And that doesn't work. There's no evidence. So the control consequences, we're in love with these as a country, and they are utterly useless, and we persist in them. And when we have alternatives, and the alternatives are what I've learned as a public health doctor, is that you think of this as a problem. You think about how to identify it, screen, detect it early, treat it early, treat it effectively, influence all those four areas of the brain, provide supports, provide hope. It's a recipe. And it's not that hard a recipe to understand, but it's a pretty hard recipe to sustain.
So it's like you could see, it makes me sad just really thinking about it, right? Because it's like you could see the problems and see the solutions. It's just hard to implement it. And people tend to just, sounds like systems tend to just repeat what they know, even if they know it doesn't work.
Yes, and they're incentivized to do that. Because if you have a program and you're making money for it, for example, or a pharma, a drug, and you're making a lot of money from that, you're going to be incentivized to continue, not to reduce the sale of OxyContin, not to reduce the number of privatized prisons in this country. So, that's a factor that we're incentivizing some of the problems to persist.
Lots of different ways that we could make this better and points where we could at least start to move things in the right direction. I think the opiate crisis did really open a lot of our eyes. I mean, it took a long time before and a lot of damage done before we got there, but it is interesting to see how we as a country are addressing it, and how, we're starting to look at it from, a doctor's office to out into the community. It's not always the person who is struggling with the addiction who wants to go get the help, but oftentimes it's that person who loves them or is closest to them who wants to get them help. And it's really hard because there's a lot of resistance sometimes, and people, it's touchy, they're ashamed, people don't know exactly what to say. So do you have any advice for people on how do you help someone go get help? And then the next thing that's so hard is what is help? And how do you know if a program is good or not? And this stuff gets so expensive. And so how can you tell if treatment's working? So any kind of advice you can give us on that would be so helpful.
These are questions that baffle many people and leave people wondering what to do. But what I urge people to do if they see a loved one, recognize the evidence of an addiction, is to find moments, not when they're high, not when they're in withdrawal, but find a moment, quiet moment, and talk to them about what you observe. not what you feel or not anything judgmental. Oh, it seems like you haven't been eating hardly any of the food that we give you in a way that you used to. It looks like you're up all night. Your friends call and you don't answer the phone. There's something going on here. And that begins the conversation. It doesn't make a judgment, it's observation. And it doesn't automatically change things, but it begins the conversation where somebody is then enabled to realize, I'm paying a price for this. And that's the whole motivational balance, that when the price gets too high, that's when people are ready for change. So you observe and you continue and you don't judge. The other thing that is really hard for many parents and brothers, sisters, is that family, I think, is a two-way street. What I mean by that is that you give and you get, that love may be unconditional, but keys to the car are not unconditional, or a credit card, or who knows what, that we're supporting that other person and we can take a position I'm going to support everything that you do that's in the interest of your having a better life, a life you're more proud of. But I'm not going to support for 1 second anything that I think is the road that you're going down now, which is destroying you. So you essentially are negotiating, you're creating contingencies. You get support when you earn it, and you don't get support, you don't get those damn car keys if you are continuing to stay up all night and smuggling in drugs, which we can smell. So those two are essential parts of working with someone you love. And then there's a moment, and you don't know when, where somebody then begins to soften, that begins to say, I guess there's something going on here. What can we do? Becomes a question. And there, any step in the right direction is the right step. It's go to a meeting, go to your family doctor, go to your clergy person. I'll go with you. I'll drive you there. I'll come in if you want. That first step is the essential one, because it then and leads often to other steps. Doesn't matter what that first step is, that's the first step. And that's when you know someone's on a path to recovery.
That makes so much sense. It's like there's no right or wrong door. Just that is getting someone, and that help might look different for different people. And it might be different for different cultures. It might be different from different stages in it. I love how you talk about, which is in some ways easier said than done, but you talk about this observation piece and not being accusatory, just approaching it from a softer perspective of, I see this, or I've seen this behavior. That is a great way to be able to have a dialogue without making someone feel defensive. I think one of our tricks is to do that at a time when we're not feeling angry, or that we haven't been, burned by that person. And it needs to come at.
Because you have, that's the real dilemma. This person has lied to you, betrayed you, stolen, created a danger in your own household. And when you've lost that position of observing, encouraging, when you get into a fight. So the key thing to keep aware of is, am I getting into a fight? Because don't get into fights. That never works. That drives people away. So in a way, that's your own thermostat for knowing whether you're in the right zone to help somebody who maybe you have all kinds of terrible feelings about because what they've done, that not because of who they are, but because of the addiction that they have.
So it doesn't really matter if it's that first step is that the beginning, it's like the portal to something. And how do you know So let's just say it's the doctor, it's whoever. And I really appreciate you saying that too, because I think so many times we don't want to give the wrong advice and we don't want to do the wrong thing. Knowing that there isn't always a right one is really helpful. But what about, how can you tell, like, how does somebody kind of know if they need to go into treatment, to like a residential recovery? Is there outpatient? Is there any sort of advice on that? Or is it just go on an exploratory journey, learn together, and kind of take that as it comes?
It's an expensive journey. It's more expensive than a cruise ship. That's really important, because I've seen many families who've mortgaged their house for the second time to pay for some rehab program, which promises all kinds of things and doesn't deliver. I think that the consideration is, where can somebody get the kind of services that are comprehensive? And what I mean by that are the services that touch those four areas of the brain, where medications are available, where cognitive or skill building is available, where supports or connections to 12-step, where families are supported and educated. That's what you look for. Sometimes it's a clinic, sometimes it's an individual therapist, sometimes it's a program. Residential programs play an important role, and usually when safety is a factor, where you're not sure that somebody will survive, that they won't go out and overdose and die, then residential programs play an important role. But they're not enough. 30 days for the chronic illness. There's no 30-day treatment for diabetes, for rheumatoid arthritis. These are chronic illnesses. So there are moments where these are necessary, but the long arc of care is what you want to keep in mind. Is somebody going to get continuous care, and the kind of care that will give them a chance, touching all the different factors that influence addiction?
Dr. Lloyd, this has been fascinating and so interesting. Where could our listeners find out more from you if they want to reach you? Where is there a place where they can go to?
Please go to my website, askdrlloyd.com, askdrlloyd.com. It's free, and I post just about everything I write, or shows and whatnot, links there, so you can pick and choose, and it's free, and you may find that some of the material there is useful to you. I hope it is.
Thank you so much. This was really, really helpful, really interesting. And I thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us.
Great to work with you.
As always, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review. If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast for the latest episodes. For the latest insights, check us out at psychhub.com.